This is a spoiler.
You can't listen to this and not have spoilers.
I'm muting myself now. Nate, you're going to start talking, right?
Oh, am I?
It's your job. Your job.
Yeah, I mean, please jump in because this is something we'll struggle through some of what I call the metaphysics. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but just what exactly is going on really, and in what sense do we mean really? I think that's a large part of the book. And part of this is hammering out plot and timeline, and those things are a little bit blurry, but so we follow Lauren and Ray. They're married together, and shortly thereafter, Ray commits suicide. Laura deals with this. She's his second wife. His first wife owns the place where he committed suicide. So he went back to his first wife to kill himself in her apartment. And she figures this out from a phone call because Lauren didn't show up to the funeral. Or she did show up to the funeral, but they didn't talk. And she spends the rest of the book mostly alone in this house. And this is what I struggle with, discovers a person living in the house. She has fantasies that it's escaped somebody from a psychiatrist ward or a psychiatric ward or a hospital or some long lost, mentally disturbed member of the owners of the house that somehow found their way back to live. But she doesn't know who this person is, and she takes care of them, gives them a nickname, Mr. Tuttle, and explores grief with this person. So we can get into all of that because sometimes it's very specific that this is an actual shit and piss human being. And at other times it could be a figment of the imagination, just like when she drives by. And I don't want to get into too many specifics, but memory and time and being are all in play here. She says the first line of the book is time seems to pass. And throughout the book, we get this notion that Mr. Tuttle, the person, is connected across all time in his being. He sees the past as the present and knows the future and connects all of these in his speech that's hard to understand. It doesn't really make sense. It's a mix of verbs and it's sing-song, and he is somehow connected to time and presence and being, and somehow her husband and herself is able to say the words back of conversations that they've had exactly, as if he was in the walls listening, but that's never proved. She doesn't know how in the world he is doing this. And so, she applies science to the problem. She starts recording all the conversations. She doesn't call out to anybody because she wants to keep him as her private thing. But she, starts just to observe him and study him and pay attention to him. And he disappears sometimes and comes around. And finally, the big twist, the real sixth sense, is that she performs this person into being with her body artist show. She inhabits this character and personality and the body type of this Mr. Tuttle person, and even uses the tape recorder sounds and mimics moving her lips over top of it in the show so that she is producing the sound. Now, I think that she was making the sounds for Mr. Tuttle in the first place and created him all along. I'm flexible on this. I want to figure out what the truth is there. But what's interesting, if that's true, is that she created a character, recorded it, then used that recording as the authentic basis of another person in the show, and by performing as if she was lip syncing that, brought him to life through the performance. And so if you look back at the body artist, what I think is happening is her processing her grief in a manifest way that culminates into Mr. Tuttle and how she performs it. However, in an interview at the end of the book, she explicitly says this is not what's happening, that it's not just a grief-stricken woman who is dealing with her past husband and that's the result of the show. It's not that simple. It's more complicated. And at the end, we're left with her alone. Mr. Tuttle is left, and she's in the house by herself.
I thought that Thank you. I think that was good. I mean, I kind of got the idea that if she said that this wasn't just processing grief, I mean, she had to become new. She had to become a new person because her life was completely upended. There was a point where she finally sat down and cried. There was a point where she finally dealt with the actual grief. And all that the Mr. Tuttle character ever did was echo or mimic. So even if you have a tape recorder, I mean, she talked about at one point how Ray would use the tape recorder and, the Mr. Tuttle character heard her speaking downstairs while Ray was doing something upstairs with a tape recorder. And so found her voice that way. But I did kind of feel like it was just, how do you create a new self when your world falls apart? The very simple view of it, I thought. She's very much associated with her body. It's her art. It's her, it's her life. It's her living. And so she experiments with being a man. And I think that also when it comes down to that and you're married to someone, he's a man and he kills himself, then there are all those things that you need to explore with the whys. The differences come up when all of a sudden they're gone.
I mean, that goes in with her, scrubbing herself down and bleaching her hair and trying to, expunge herself. And, even, at the very end, she puts the spray bottle to her head and mimes shooting herself in the head as her husband did. That little act is trying to connect to the experience of that, while also knowing, as the narrative reminds us all the time, that that's not quite right. All of her imaginations for the way things are going, not all of them, but often her imaginations take a hard right turn into reality. So, for example, she's driving down the street and she sees a guy on a sun porch stretched out and imagines that she can see all of his life in the present of that moment and knows that he was like a miserly man who was like not nice to his children and all of these things, and sees total clarity, and then realizes that it's actually a paint can and a board and there's no person on there at all. She just missaw and projected all of that there. And this happens several times in other ways. She's trying to hold on to what's happening for sure. And Mr. Tuttle does cry. He does moan just prior to the way that she finally breaks down and moans and has that moment of grief. He does her voice and Ray's voice, and is something altogether different whenever he has his own voice as well. That's squeakish and, shrill and atonal.
I wonder why he was described at one point in the books as retarded. Wasn't that word used?
I think that she dismissed that as a possibility, but that was a hypothetical thing that this could be. It could be that this was an escaped person, right? Like I think I mentioned some of those. She tries to reckon him. And there's a specific line somewhere that was, she just wanted to analyze the situation and make sense of this, because it's not clear to me, it's at the end of the story what really happened, in quotes. And I think to her also, it's not clear either, because while we can imagine that this is her working through it and taking in the body, I still don't know what to make of that she took him to the mall one time and whenever she came back, he had like defecated all over himself. I don't know metaphorically or spiritually what that is.
I thought that she just never got out of the car. I just thought that, that she just like was there sitting there in she had just sat there the whole time. And
I thought so too. But then she had said that she had brought things back to the car in her shopping bags. Now that could have been a memory of what it's like to go to the shopping mall, granted. And I thought similarly that it was her taking this in and maybe she just sat in the car and just lost it. It's a blurry reality because she explores him, and washes him and bathes him. Yeah, it must be a figment of her imagination, but at the same time, it's presented as material fact at others. So,
can I just read this from this article that I saw in the New York Times about this book? It was written back when it was published in 2001. Is that right? And the writer, he says, maybe you've already guessed that The Body Artist is not weightless after all. A metaphysical ghost story about a woman alone and not alone in a large rented seaside house. The novel invests the simplest domestic detail with a heavy burden of significance. Breakfast in the kitchen, the virtuoso first scene, which is a scene I love, expands in space and time, each showcased moment stretching to eternity, every movement, the shaking of the juice carton, seismic. The dailiness is at once inconsequential and eloquent, vast and dense. In just 124 pages, DeLillo finds room to ponder large themes how we structure time and how we are structured by it, how we express grief or fail to express it, how an artist makes sense or not of calamity, and the equivocal role language plays in all of this. I love that first scene, that breakfast scene. I loved the way he captures each moment. And also, I wanted to ask about this. In the scene, and they're having their coffee and looking out the window and talking and not talking. And I don't know if anybody else picked up on this, and I'm thinking maybe I'm crazy. But on page 6, she picked a hair out of her mouth. She stood at the counter looking at it, a short, pale strand that wasn't hers and wasn't his. She kept looking at the hair. And then I noticed, I think it was on page 73, and this is why I think I love that first scene so much, because it just did so much. I think it was when she was in the bathroom when Mr. Tuttle was in the bathtub.
Yeah,
right?
She got another hair from him.
Yeah, she felt something wispy at the edge of her mouth, half in, half out. That could only be a hair. She plucked it and brushed it with her thumb, a strand of her hair from the washcloth, and she couldn't feel it on her face anymore. And she looked at him and looked at her hand, and maybe it was just an itch. I don't know. Again, this goes back to the way DeLillo just digs into the moment. I mean, a hair, right, obviously, in and of itself is the smallest of moments. And it's fascinating to me that it was such an intense thing at the first scene, and here it is 70 pages later, a very short book. Again, this question about this hair.
Yeah, I mean, that's happening all over the place. That's really what's going on. There's a time where Mr. Tuttle. Yeah.
What was interesting was that she was so freaked out about it, and she was so sure that it wasn't hers and it wasn't his, and who knows about that? But it's a rental. It's not their house. It could be a fucking hair anywhere. It's somebody else's house. You think that it's like sterile when you get there?
I know, but she cues in on it, and DeLillo writes about it. About that particular hair. That's what I find fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was definitely Chekhov's gun that would show up later, and then was not surprised when it turned out that it was from, if you're thinking of Mr. Tuttle as her, then it was going to be, this is something she put the washcloth to her face, and then there was a hair. It was her face, it was her hair.
But at the same time, she was sure it wasn't in the beginning.
I don't know about you. The first time I found a gray hair, I was sure it wasn't mine. But it was.
I was just going to say that on 7, that idea is expanded a little bit. She said she scraped her upper teeth over her tongue to rid her system of the complicated sense memory of someone else's hair. That complicated sense memory, I think, is useful in thinking about like how she uses her body and what's going on in the story. And I just love that first scene too. One of my favorite parts is it's this on 14. She puts her hand on Ray's shoulder and then moves past him, and they have birds on a feeder outside. And she says that, or the narrative says, the birds broke off the feeder in a wing whir that was all B's and R's. The letter B followed by a series of vibrato R's. But that wasn't it at all. That wasn't anything like it. And this, that wasn't it. That's not it. Somehow, what does somehow mean? All of these like trying to dig in and questioning, and the narrative will wrap up real tight like that sometimes, give you something beautiful, and then unwind itself by saying that's not the reality either. They're missing something. And I just think that that's a beautiful thing that happens throughout the book.
Maybe that's why a response on DeLillo's part about this monumental grief. Because, I don't know what y'all's experience was, but I read through the first scene and I was like, this is amazing. And to me, it's water just passing through. I'm very easily floating. And that's the sense I got from the first scene. And then, of course, turn the page, he's killed himself, which immediately introduces a major mountain in the water. It was shocking to me. And I'm just wondering, given the structure of that first chapter and then the second chapter on DeLillo's part, it seemed like these moments of life at the breakfast table, you got a sense of sort of the difficulty or non-difficulty in the marriage, or two people happy and not happy, just the whole sort of dynamic of that existence. And then it's kind of thrown into this chaos that is so immense that it's hard to capture even. And I'm wondering if after that suicide, after that second chapter, that's why the rest of the book is structured in such a way that Nathan says, I'm not quite sure if that's real or not real. You know what I'm saying? because the quality and the extent and the expansion of the grief is so enormous.
Yeah, I think that's why there's two scenes where it clips out to objective views of someone else reporting on the fact of the death and then the fact of the show, because I think it might be impossible really to do that or to make the point within the worldview of this character because it is this transient reality.
Because it's all memory, right? Once they're gone, it's all memory.
I also saw the difference between the first scene, which I also loved, and I think it was sort of displaying how, at least from her perspective, that they were communicating incredibly well, not verbally at all times. And then in contrast to her meeting Mr. Tuttle, that sort of throws into question the idea of communication in general and if it is in fact understood mutually.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Tuttle is a bit of a shock to her system because he doesn't seem to make any clear sense. You know, he can look through time, it seems, and just stare off. He disappears and then comes in. He kind of rejects. It was put something like the intersection between reality and space and language. There's got to be an imaginary point where you make a connection and can call something a word. And he doesn't seem to have that. She tries to tell him the words for things and gets mimicry back. And she can lose herself in his reverie and speaking, or he can surprise her and not be talking and she'll be reading him a story and then realize that he is speaking in Ray's voice to her and she hadn't noticed it. But if she goes back, she can remember starting to hear it a little bit. I mean, it's very fuzzy. And I think that's what's, really beautiful about this book is memory and presence, really.
It seems like that happens a lot. There's a sort of recurring phenomenon where meaning or significance or recognition or something like that will show up obliquely, but when she turns to try to attend it directly, it seems somehow insubstantial or to have an unfixed meaning.
Yeah, the idea of meaning, do you remember the scene where she's confronted by the owners of the house who want to, get a chest of drawers out? Because it has meaning to them. And the scene is almost awkward in a way because she seems non-responsive, almost like the Tuttle character, right? And I think the chapter just ends, it kind of drifts off without really understanding how it ended, if she acquiesced to their demands or if she stayed non-communicative.
Yeah, it does just switch right over into the next day. And I thought that it was interesting because I think it even said she was non-responsive because it started with her fantasy. It started the way that her fantasy started of a person who was going to come and explain to her who Mr. Tuttle was. And no one's going to be able to explain to her who Mr. Tuttle is. She has to do that herself. It's coming, I thought, it's coming of her. This is from her. No one can come from the outside and say, this is who this is, because you've created him. You've created this. This is your grief. Yeah, there are a few times where she thinks she sees things from the corner of her eye and thinks, oh, maybe I should go to the eye doctor. Because you have these moments you think that maybe you can grasp. And you can have moments of clarity, like you can dissect a day. But you can't take the whole thing in its entirety. Like, you can't understand. You can look at a morning and say everything seemed fine. But then the enormity of, number one, he's gone. Number two, he killed himself. He killed himself in his first wife's apartment. I thought that she was actually his third wife. Our character.
I think you're right about
Lauren
that.
Was actually his third. I think that Lauren is his third wife.
Where do you get that? I didn't get that. I thought I think
it was actually written. I think it was. And then I also loved the idea of, people become covetous of the dead, and the scene where his first wife basically tries to take him back as, I was never gone. And he came to my place to kill himself. Like, he was my husband. You know what I mean? And then just like the confusion of that. When someone dies, people do want, it's almost like with Camus, how, boy, I never love them like I love them when they're dead. Everyone wants a piece of the dead person. They want their experience with them to be significant.
Or the experience, right?
Yeah.
The understanding. She understood him rather than another person.
Yeah, that's why he came here to kill himself. Watch what you're proud of.
Everybody wants to take ownership of it. And there's this sort of thing that's going on, I think, with Laura sometimes where, is it Laura or Lauren?
It's Lauren.
Lauren, right. Okay.
It's Lauren.
Confuse her with Laura.
Well, I want to get that right so there's no confusion when we're listening to this. There's a constant theme, I think, of her trying to objectify her own perceptions and her own memories. And I think to me, that's a big part of what Mr. Tuttle is. He's this sort of, he's this reflection that she's either consciously or unconsciously objectifying in order to try to validate her understanding of Ray. And sometimes he seems to be very, I think that corresponds to how true and how vividly he shows up is how successful she is at objectifying, because she's looking at this divide of what is this subjective element of my perception of my husband? You know, what is construct? What is my personal composition of him? That, you know, that creative element to perception, and then what is the thing itself? What is him? You know, how does he understand himself? What is the thing beyond perception? I think that's what's interesting about the fact that she is the body artist, is because this first person, third person split is sort of an obsession for Don DeLillo. He's explored it in, you know, many different novels, but the body is the place where we get that convergence, right? It's the only site or territory where we get to examine the first person and the third person at once. And so her imitation of him, you know, her art, I think I tried to sort of draw up a little list of binaries, you know, where you could get that sort of mind-body thing in all of these different ways in the novel, you know, the art and the body and, you know, the feel of things, and then the thing itself, the conception, you know, what does she notice and what does she fabricate? That's all wrapped up in the way that she perceives Mr. Tuttle. I mean, did you guys get any of that?
Yeah, I mean, didn't she was asking Mr. Tuttle, or was trying to demand of Mr. Tuttle to kind of explain, or like tell her about Ray, or to tell her more. In that sense, you're saying, or you could think that she thought her understanding or her relationship with Ray was something objective, something that was out there, that she demanded Mr. Tuttle tell her. But he never gave that up, right?
I mean, he would do things, you know, but he couldn't be made to operate, you know. He wasn't like a toy you could wind up and like, or he wasn't like putting on a video of your wedding or something. You know, she couldn't go back and like remember and see how he was and hear his laugh really. You know, she had things like the smell of smoke in the house and his bullshit autobiography. And again, sense memories all over the place that were complicated and wrapped up in her and her identity and how she used to think something and then have him respond. I mean, just the internal exploration of this is, you don't see grief really tackled like this. And this way, I believe in ghosts in a metaphorical way, because they can still haunt you the way that they haunt Lauren. You know, that sounds like maybe he's in the room. Now he really is in the room and I can see him. Oh, no, wait, that was out of the corner of my eye. That doesn't, you know, he's gone now. And I think that that's what Tuttle taps into, is that sense memory, you know, and in her own thoughts. I just found another one where she's questioning him and he says, somehow, what is somehow? And she says, shut up. But then like 30 pages later, she says the same thing. Somehow, what is somehow? You know, this is her internal and external process, like going in and out.
Well, and then who was the real Tuttle was this pathetic teacher from grammar school, right?
Yeah, that everyone felt sorry for.
Yeah, she's assigned this, like, okay, it sounds like this person who in my youth I found pathetic, or we all found pathetic. Even though I think she liked him, she was going in weak. She's going in weak because she's had this terrible experience of her husband dying by his own hand. And how does she choose to relate to that? It starts using a character who is pathetic. I'm sure that she is seeing herself as pathetic from the outset, because something else is obviously going on with Ray that morning, right? You're having a very normal breakfast, and he was obviously planning, and she knew he was planning something, because she says at the end that she hid his keys and, you know, please don't go and don't worry, you know, I'm just going to pick up a few things. If we need anything, you know, I'll be back. He's not going to be back. And she somehow knows that. But if you just take and slice everything into the moments, it's a different thing, right? It's not the morning that, I mean, it still is the morning that he killed himself, but we had this connection.
Yeah, the moments are interesting because the thing is sort of composed of the moments, sort of like, you know, the layers of an onion. It is just all those layers, you know, amalgamated, but there's no sort of nucleus, you know, there's no center essential thing that is this person. And it reminds me of, like, in White Noise, the guy's name was Mr. Gray or something like that. And Jack Gladney's like, who is Mr. Gray, Babette, the person she's supposed to be having an affair with? And she's like, well, he's really a composite. He's not anybody. He's just, and Tuttle is kind of a composite like that, right? He's a composite. He's a piece of this teacher. He's pieces of Ray. He's moments, he's memories. And like Nathan was saying, like sometimes the environment evokes him very strongly, and then sometimes he's sort of not there and she's looking for him. And it reminds me of that way, when someone's not there anymore and you lose someone, that sometimes you can feel them very strongly. Sometimes the environment that you're in or some memory you have really brings them across to you and they feel right there. And then other times you're looking for them, you're struggling to hold on to those memories, but it feels like they're fleeting. They don't come back as strong. And there's something about it too, that the more you try to summon them vividly in that way, the more they sort of get diluted.
I want to read this for a second. Okay, it's on page 39. She was in the kitchen when she heard it this time. She carried her tea upstairs, the room's at the end of the second-story hall, the dim third story. Bulbs blown and most of the furniture removed. Short stairway to the cupola. She looked into the stillness, head swiveling, her upper body projected into the structure, which was fairly broad and used as storage space. Her tea was cold by the time she stood on the floor of the cupola. She poked into old clothing layered in cardboard boxes and looked at the documents gone brittle in leather folders. There was a stuffed owl and a stack of unframed watercolors badly warped. She saw a twirling leaf just outside the window. It was a small amber leaf twirling in the air beneath a tree branch that extended over the roof. There was no sign of a larva web from which the leaf might be suspended, or a strand of some bird's nest building material. Just the leaf in midair, turning. She found him the next day in a small bedroom off the large empty room at the far end of the hall on the third floor. He was smallish and fine-bodied, and at first she thought he was a kid, sandy-haired and roused from deep sleep or medicated maybe. He sat on the edge of the bed in his underwear. In the first second, she thought he was inevitable. I think that's an important line. She felt her way back in time to the earlier indications that there was someone in the house, and she arrived at this instant unerringly with her perceptions all sorted and endorsed. This kind of makes me wonder. We're all weaving back and forth. Is he a manifestation of her grief? Is he a memory? Is he reality? Is the grief so enormous that he's inevitable, like she said here? But what does that line say? I mean, it's phenomenal, that line.
Yeah, he's tiny. He's sitting on the edge of his bed. He's a sad little thing, right? That's what made me think that he was the personification of her grief. So helpless. He was a child there.
And that's what she is.
Well, that's what you are in the face of your grief, right? And until you deal with it, right. You are, a turtle on your back. You're a child. You're powerless before your grief if you don't deal with it. Again, it's interesting. It's somebody else's house. I think that's, by the time I got to the end of it, I realized how important it was that it was someone else's house. She isn't going through, it's a house where they stayed, but she's not going, all of these things that are in the attic, the warped watercolors and stuff like that, the dresser that someone wants to, that the owner comes to take away, it's not theirs. It's not hers. All those things that are in the house, this person in the house isn't hers. The hair, whatever. I think that was very interesting, that he placed it somewhere that wasn't their home.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about grief and the way that DeLillo gets at it is that when you're grieving, you're constantly somewhere else, right? It's whatever you're actually doing, you're constantly drawn back to, these memories and this thing that is stealing your concentration. It's sort of, siphoning you away from the moment that you would otherwise be experiencing, and you're kind of a divided consciousness. There's a lot of time in this novel. And I read that he considers, and I won't go into this much, but he considers this book that came not long after that, Point Omega, to be a companion piece, almost kind of a sequel to this book.
What? Whoa.
And that book was all about time as well. And I don't know. Did you guys have any thoughts about the way that time plays into the way that we experience other people and our relationships and how we know each other and ourselves?
Yeah, that boundary between other people. And I was just looking at this. This was in the breakfast scene. I've been looking backwards and I can't find it. I think it's apropos of nothing, but it's in the middle of 18. She says, all day yesterday I thought it was Friday. He said what? Or you become someone else, one of the people in the story, doing dialogue of your own devising. You become a man at times, living between the lines. doing another version of the story, she thought and read. That's her, exploring this and what the exploration is, because the narrative seems like the voice in her head. It seems like we're living through this. She second guesses herself, and the narrative does also. So as far as exploring other people.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense because the grief is so overwhelmingly huge. I mean, it'd be different, let's say, if he died after a long illness or something. I mean, although when he drove off and she tried to hide his keys, she knew he wasn't coming back?
That's her secondhand memory. So that I believe that happens the second time whenever she deals with it. That's after she cries or just before she cries. She goes upstairs and she's remembering the last time that she saw him, and she wants to hide his keys, eat them, destroy them so that he can't leave. And this is her fantasy, knowing now what she knows. But I don't think at the time that she did know that he was going to commit suicide. His second wife, though, did, and said so in the phone call. And interestingly, he went there to commit suicide and not in the house. I mean, imagine how different this could have been if Ray had killed himself in the house. I mean, it couldn't be. He would have known that would have been too much for her. I mean, in a way, there's no material presence of her husband left. He expunged himself, and now she's left with just the phantoms, and conjures this guy Tuttle, out of all that she's known about him and conjectures and things.
Why do you think that DeLillo chose to make her the second, third wife, whatever? I guess the third wife. That the woman who we're learning about here, whose grief we're experiencing, is the third wife. Why do you think that is?
It fits in the theme of significance and time. She obviously only knew him for a short duration, and therefore she can't fully, or he's not fully hers. And I thought the first scene I was confused about this because I thought the first scene was about the significance of time and how order and duration matters in significance. I mean, everything is so well explained in that first scene, and the moments gain significance due to their sort of duration. The bird is described in the feeder, the smell of the soybeans or whatever is described, and that kind of breaks apart for the rest of the novel, and I wasn't sure what to make of that. It's kind of abstracted away. Instead of an ordered sequence of events, it becomes chaotic and abstract, and even her art piece kind of dealt with the idea of repetition and meaninglessness almost. So I'm not sure if anyone else picked up on that or had any ideas on that.
Yeah, I like part of what you just said. The question of whether you can ever really know someone, I think is part of what you're getting at, Laura, and what Cesare raised. I mean, that's a part of this novel, I think. He had two other wives before. They knew a part of him that she never can know. And the other wife kind of throws that in her face a little bit in the phone call. But it's true of every relationship we have. We don't have total ownership over the other person. We don't know the self, of themselves that they know, and we don't know the aspect of them from other people's perspectives. And so there's a kind of alienation there, even in our most intimate relationships, that is significant, I think.
Yeah, I think that a few of the things in here made me realize why people thought that David Foster Wallace cribbed a little from him.
What, he cribbed a little from DeLillo?
Yeah. The idea that you can never know, you can never be in somebody else's head. You can never really know anyone. I think that it's doubtful that you can never actually know yourself. But then the idea that there's someone that you would know. I thought that there were a few things that were interesting about her being the third wife, in that he obviously hadn't stopped trying. The clue from the second or first wife, who knows, that he's always been, this was always inevitable, that he was going to kill himself. You think that you could have changed that, or if you think that you could have done something about that. And really what it was is if you think that he could have done something about that, there is no way that another marriage, another screenplay, a house by the seashore, I'm making quote marks, he had everything going for him, a beautiful wife, a lovely relationship, and still he had that he was going to kill himself. I think that is part of why she was the third wife, because it wasn't that he hadn't made attempts to get him, to move himself into a better place. It just didn't work.
Yeah, and he seemed a little envious of her happiness in the breakfast scene. He says, you're happy, you're always happy. You're happy in this house.
Yeah, shut the fuck up. It's 7:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
That was a part of it too, that they were having there was a little antagonism between them in the breakfast scene. And you get from him that this isn't regular. They usually don't have breakfast together. But today they are. And she's trying to get him to talk about something and he won't. I'm not sure. It seems like that could have been the suicide, but it also may have been because they start talking about a sound in the house that they both heard. And you don't know it yet, but is the beginnings of Mr. Tuttle or just the presence that they're in a rented house with in someone else's space.
It's a rented house. It's a rented marriage, a rented relationship, rented life.
We're all just renters, right?
Yeah, we are actually.
We have pretty damn short leases too. So.
And you know what? They actually said that in the book. It says that in the book that she stayed past the lease.
Well, and because he said that she would stay there. And then even later she said that her knowing that that's what he wanted and her doing it might annul any truth of his prediction. She might just be, what do you call that? Whenever you do the self-fulfilling prophecy, she could be doing it to honor him. And it's not exactly the prophetic vision that he had of her staying there, but they're connected there. And so that's interesting. That's another way that like their relationship and the spiritual element of that between them manifests itself really, because this was just an idea that he had about her, and then she was bringing it to be.
There was the moment that she had with Tuttle where she said, why did you just change tenses? You went from you went from the past to the present to the future, or you went from the past to the present. You said that I do stay, you said I would, and that now you say I do. And I thought that was interesting.
No, you're right, because that whole thing is spattered across this novel. It's like there are a number of times when time seems to sort of break down in that James Joycean kind of way. Like I'm thinking of like Ulysses in the Circe chapter, or the present seems and the past and the future all seem to sort of like mix and meld together. And she's seeing things before they happen and anticipating things that are going to happen later. And then when they do happen, it's like, oh yes, I knew that this was going to happen. Of course it's happening just as I thought it would. And it's funny, like I hear people saying that things like that all the time. I've heard people with different theories about the election lately say, things are happening, just according to my theories of the world, just according to my understanding of ideology. Things, are unplaying exactly as I perceived they would. And isn't it weird how we all kind of do that,
Man, anybody who wants to take ownership of this shit can have it. I am not covetous of this moment in time. Like, take it.
But you're right. He's right. Daniel, you're right.
I thought that it was a little, like, I got a little bit of a feel of, and I can't remember, I mean, I read the book 40, 30 years ago, like, it was either Malloy or Malone, one of the Beckett novels, and I got the feeling when she's got a voice in her head, I had a little bit of a feeling of Beckett, of like, and I can't put my finger on the scene, but it's like walking down a road, of the sparseness of it. I mean, it starts out so detailed with that breakfast, and then it becomes a sparse thing, and you have to switch gears. I don't know that Beckett ever starts out detailed, but certainly is sparse. There's a lot of, you have to read a lot into what he writes. I got the feeling.
That's a great connection.
I have found Beckett to be the most difficult for me to understand. I spent more time trying to parse Beckett than anything. I mean, certainly way more than Joyce. Because I love the language, I love the way that it moves, and of what I could parse, I loved what he was saying, but I always found him difficult.
Well, a lot of people I know find DeLillo, or I understand him to be a divisive author. A lot of people I know love him. A lot of people can't stand his language. They find it cold, and he's associated with a sort of postmodern fiction, which I don't know that he would identify with personally, but he's sort of shoved in that box a lot of the time. Different people feel strongly in different ways about him.
I could not get, I think I tried reading White Noise 3 or 4 times. I just couldn't get into it. And maybe I'll try again now that I actually enjoyed this so much. There was something else that I tried to read by him, and now I don't remember what it was, and put that down also. Like, nothing about it thrilled me. And then I tried reading White Noise again because Nathan liked it so much. And I was like, I still can't quite get in there. But maybe now that I've read something that I enjoyed, I will give it another go.
Yeah, this is my first DeLillo.
You liked it?
I'd say I was, I like her conversation almost more than the, than the book. I really liked the beginning, and I really wasn't sure of the project he was undertaking. I still think we should dig into the art piece and exactly what she was getting out of that. I know it was mentioned how she had to inhabit him.
Read a little of it, because that's a good point, because that's the title of the book and the center of this. I mean, it's arguable that this whole thing is an art piece of hers.
Well, he's all in his head, right? He's a writer, the husband, Ray, and she's all in her body. Not that she's not a thinker, but she's all in her body. And he shoots himself in the head. Also interesting.
I heard something interesting about, just by the way, that, and this might just be fiction that I read from like Chuck Palahniuk or something, but I heard that when women shoot themselves, they shoot themselves in the heart, and that when men shoot themselves, they shoot themselves in the head. I'd never heard that before, but it was interesting and I think pertinent to this.
Is this backed up by statistics?
No. This isn't a science, but I guess it could be found out. I mean, it's a fact claim, but I had heard that, and I thought that was an interesting getting to this, like trying to knock out your intellect or trying to knock out your body.
Yeah, I tend to shoot myself in the foot, and I do it at least on a weekly basis. I haven't tried for the head or the heart.
I didn't mean to derail there, but we should talk about the art piece itself.
I can read a bit from the review chapter. Body art in extremis, slow, sparse, and painful. She is not pale-skinned so much as colorless, bloodless, and ageless. She is raw-boned and slightly bug-eyed. Her hair looks terroristic. It is not trimmed but chopped, and the natural chestnut luster is ash-white now, with faint pink traces. I'll skip ahead. The piece, called Body Time, sneaked into town for 3 nights, unadvertised except by word of mouth, and drew eager audiences whose intensity did not always maintain itself for the duration of the show. Hartke clearly wanted her audience to feel time go by, viscerally, even painfully. This is what happened, causing walkouts among the less committed. They missed the best stuff. Hartke is a body artist who tries to shake off the body, hers anyways. There's the man who stands in an art gallery while a colleague fires bullets into his arm. This is art. There is a lavishly tattooed man who has himself fitted with a crown of thorns. This is art. Hartke's work is not self-strutting or self-lacerating. She is acting, always in the process of becoming another or exploring some root identity. I'll just skip part the last piece which describes it. Hartke's piece begins with an ancient Japanese woman on a bare stage, gesturing in a stylized manner of no drama. And it ends 75 minutes later with a naked man, emaciated and aphasic, trying desperately to tell us something.
Interesting. The Japanese woman from the neighborhood. You just brought that to mind. I should say that I got the read along thing. Like, I have the book on my Kindle and I got the audio that went along with it. And I listened to the book. I just took 4 flights and I listened to the book on every flight, and I fell asleep while listening on every flight and tried to find my way back to where I was. And I actually recognize what you just said, but I know I was sleeping when it went by. But it's interesting that she notices the Japanese woman in the neighborhood on the porch a number of times during the book, right? And the last time that she saw her, she was doing nothing, I think.
Well, the last time she saw her, she realized that the woman had her hands balled up into her sleeves to keep them warm.
Oh, and she wished that she had done that, right?
Yes, and she realized that the whole character was in that motion and that she should have could explore that.
There's another part of this chapter that I wanted to add to Cesare.
Well, if you have something, I had something a little bit longer to say about the performance piece. So if you have something shorter, go ahead.
I don't have anything shorter myself, but I wanted to add something to what Cesare read, this is on page 113. Quote, maybe the idea is to think of time differently, Lauren says after a while. Stop time or stretch it out or open it up. Make a still life that's living, not painted. When time stops, so do we. We don't stop, we become stripped down, less self-assured. I don't know, in dreams or high fevers or doped up or depressed. Doesn't time slow down or seem to stop? What's left? Who's left? Didn't she say she wanted this art piece to be even slower?
Yeah. She says she's not happy with it, and could do more, and says it probably needs to be more slower. Then the person, she's like, maybe 3 hours. And then the person says, what about 6 or 7? And she says, what about 8?
And Nathan, there's your connection to Point Omega, because if you remember how that book opens, it's a 24-hour slowed down art exhibition of the movie Psycho.
I thought of that at the time and did not remember it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So for everybody else, what it is like that book opens with this guy. He's attending this art piece, and it's the movie Psycho slowed down to where it takes 24 hours to watch. And he's just standing in there over and over watching this movie happen really, really slowly and talking about what you notice and how it changes the way you understand.
The way you understand the movie, you mean?
The movie and just the phenomenon of what you're perceiving. I mean, what that's the thing. What is the movie then? The movie it breaks down into those perceptions, and what are they?
When was that book written?
Point Omega. I'm not sure. It's one of his later ones. It might be his second latest one.
So there's also, you've got time, as much as you study time and as much as you want to stretch things out. When there is death, there is an end of time, and that's it. And so wanting to make it longer is interesting because it's this examination of the death of some, you can't go back and get that time again. And yeah, of course you would want to stretch it out.
Well, it's the end, but it's not the end at the same time, right? It's like, what is different? The physical other person there is removed, but your ideas and your memories of them sort of keep going. I thought of like this, there was a couple of guys that I did this theater study group with for a while, and we studied this guy, Jerzy Grotowski, and he was a Polish theater figure, and he was a really sort of weird, obscure, sort of new agey kind of guy, but extremely interesting in my opinion. And for a while, he was doing this thing where he was taking these people out, and they had sort of dispensed with the audience at this point. They were doing performance art almost totally for the sake of the actors themselves. And he talked about it as the actors being the seat of experience. So in my understanding, what he was trying to do is he was trying to break down that barrier between the spectator and the actor, which is sort of that same first person, third person dynamic. I just wanted to read a little bit of this part from the Grotowski source book where he's talking about it, because it reminds me so much of the body artist piece that this girl is doing. And he's talking about the habits of daily life in the body. And he says, what happens when daily life techniques of the body, which are habits in a definite cultural circle, are suspended? When they're suspended, what appears? Well, what first appears is the deconditioning of perception. Habitually, an incredible quantity of stimuli are flowing into us from outside. Something is speaking to us all the time. But we are programmed in such a way that our attention records exclusively those stimuli that are in agreement with our learned image of the world. In other words, all the time we tell ourselves the same story. So that to me sort of gets at like this thing where, like the birds are looking at them through the window, and she's wondering, what do the birds see when they see and hear? And that kind of obviates the fact that there are these stories about what's going on that we've already interpreted as we've perceived events through time, people, personality, what we're doing, the situation at hand, that the birds wouldn't perceive. They just see this sort of raw stimuli, or they see it in whatever way they interpret the world. All of this sort of stuff that, like Nathan was saying, we project onto the situation. How do you distinguish that from what's really going on?
That's a part of it. Back to that review section, I think that, and I think I referenced this at the beginning, but she says this, how simple it would be if I could say this is a piece that comes directly out of what happened to Ray, but I can't. Be nice if I could say this is the drama of men and women versus death. I want to say that, but I can't. It's too small and secluded and complicated, and I can't, and I can't, and I can't. This is the narrative of the interviewer now. Then she does something that makes me freeze in my seat. She switches to another voice. It's the voice of the naked man's, Mr. Tuttle's. And then she excuses herself and ditches the restaurant. It's not clear, and I guess I don't really have a point. I'm trying to draw these threads in because, whenever she's seeing the Japanese woman, whenever she's seeing Ray, whenever she's being these different things, she's processing it, and it has a own level of truth. And going to what you were saying, Mary, and Daniel, I think that there's a little bit of a division here because whenever someone does die, they do die, and time does stop for them. But whenever someone dies in your life, you are continuing on with that memory and with those things. And it's complicated because then it's
Yeah, but that's a change in time.
Yes. Yeah. They both are. And it's relative in this way. Someone can just be gone, but then someone else can still be processing you and you can still be living on, so to speak. and, be changed in memories and in stories or whatever.
You can do it in a day. I mean, you can do something in the morning, or someone can say something to you in the morning that meant nothing to them offhand. It can ruin your entire fucking day. So I don't know if this has ever happened to anyone else, but then you realize like this meant nothing. So it's not even just if they're dead. It's like they walked away. The moment is over. You could take a moment and replay it for the rest of your life if you want to, and focus on that. It's interesting, Daniel, you talking about that theater group. I think I read something about that or saw a film or something about that group going out into the forest and spending a bunch of time it's just about them. And I wonder about time, if the way that we perceive things, because we're mayflies, because we have such short durations, certainly compared to a tree or a rock or a piece of dirt, or even, a whale. Like we have a very short amount of time. And certainly we have a short amount of time where we have our faculties, where we can actually do a lot of processing that we would consider, adult, processing that we're involved in. And so all of the things that we don't notice because we don't have time, because we're mayflies.
And I think that kind of connects in with Mr. Tuttle and what he's allowing her to do, which is to go through different times and tap into something that's, the intersection of those and some kind of like ultimate present, that's moving and doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's outside of those. I mean, like you're saying, we see the world in the terms that we've, figured out. So we wake up and we're in our apartment in wherever city, like we start constructing these things. And, you can ask specific questions of people and they can give you specific answers. But you can't really do that with Mr. Tuttle. And you can press him on something and it'll just kind of go sideways or dip in and out of something.
I want to read a section here. This is page 104. His future is not under construction. It is already there, susceptible to entry. She had it on tape. She did not want to believe this was the case. It was her future, too. It is her future, too. She played the tape a dozen times. It means your life and death are set in place, just waiting for you to keep the appointments. She listened to him say, "Don't touch it. I'll clean it up later. It is the thing you know nothing about." Then she said it herself some days later. He'd been in there with her. It was her future, not his. How much myth do we build into our experience of time? "Don't touch it," she said. He'd known this was going to happen. There were the words she would say. He'd been in there with her. "I'll clean it up later." She wanted to create her future, not enter a state already shaped to her outline. Something is happening. It has happened. It will happen. This is what she believed. There is a story, a flow of consciousness and possibility. The future comes into being, but not for him. He hasn't learned the language. There was to be an imaginary point, a non-place where language intersects with our perceptions of time and space. And he is a stranger at this crossing, without words or bearings. But what did she know? Nothing. This is the rule of time. It is the thing you know. It is the thing you know nothing about. She listened to him say it on tape, in a voice that was probably hers. But she could have made it up, much of it, not from scratch, but in retrospect, in memory. But she had it on tape, and it was him, and he was saying it. Then she said it herself, but so what? So what if she said the same thing in the same words? Means nothing. People saying the same thing. She had it on tape saying it, but she might easily have misremembered what she herself said when he dropped the water glass. Might have been different. Slightly, very moderately different. But so what if it's the same? Past, present, and future are not amenities of language. Time unfolds into the seams of being. It passes through you, making and shaping. But not if you are him. This is a man who remembers the future. Don't touch it. I'll clean it up later. Which, by the way, is one of my favorite lines of this book. Don't touch it. I'll clean it up later. So this, to me, was saying a lot about time and also bringing into perspective or bringing into point Mr. Tuttle, that this is a man who remembers the future. And I know that, like we had mentioned earlier, that he had been described as retarded or not. I don't know. But the other thing that comes out of this to me is that this chaos in this page and a half, it seems to me to also reflect, obviously, the enormous grief that she's going through and that it's just overtaking her. And that if, in fact, Mr. Tuttle is there. And in reality, of course, he remembers the future. Of course, he's bringing up time this way, in a very chaotic way, aside from the fact that I'm sounding chaotic myself. But you know what I mean? I mean, I'm fascinated by the way he's written this. In order to write about this kind of grief, it has to be this chaotic. Because even when we talked in the last few minutes or last 10 minutes or whatever about when someone dies, time takes on a different character for them, obviously, and for us, because they become a memory for us. So we are remembering the future. Anyway, I'm just reacting to the chaos of his writing, which is beautiful, but necessary because of the expanse of this grief that she is going through. And again, have we all come to a decision as to whether Mr. Tuttle is real?
He's a real character.
I'm sure it's the most interesting question.
Yeah. I don't know that you have to. Like, I don't, yeah. I think that you can interpret him different ways as you're moving along with your own interpretation of the story.
Saying I was leaning towards imagination, and the weird sexual aspect of it kind of convinced me of that, because I didn't want to deal with what it would mean if she was, sexually fondling a person that escaped from a psychiatric institution.
Right.
2 days after her husband killed himself.
I didn't get the sense of the time that had passed from, like, where his suicide fit in, except for that it happened later in the day from that morning. And then all of the time that she spent afterward in that house. I never got a real sense of where I was in relation to his death or her being in that house, because there were so many things that happened that I think were actually spaced farther apart than a day or two. The landlord coming
he's
and
made ambiguous and troubled so many of the markers by which you would know time in the novel that it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know something about the lease, and I think that there's phone calls that come from her friend who ends up being the interviewer at the end, and then, also the second wife. But yeah, I mean, it does get, it's not a very long time. I mean, we're not talking years, even by the end of it, I don't think. It's a matter of.
What, you mean the time of the whole book?
Yes. Yeah. The time span, I think, must be within a year, a couple of months, that she's in the house past the lease, and then, performing and then going back to the house even.
So they had a 6 month lease. They had a 6 month lease. It wasn't 6 weeks. It was 6 months.
Yeah, she had 6 weeks left on it or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's that much time left on it, I believe, when the whole thing happened.
But she stays beyond it.
I had a question about the so-called owner who shows up. Remember? He shows up because he wants that dresser.
He's the, mundane life walks in? Yeah.
Well, I mean, my question is, does mundane life walk in? And if it does, I mean, remember he shows up after, theoretically, Mr. Tuttle disappears or disappeared?
Mr. Tuttle comes in and out and is back again. I think he's back again after that, even. After
the owner came looking for the dresser?
Maybe not, no.
But my question is, why did he do that? What was DeLillo's point of bringing in the owner looking for a dresser at that point?
Well, I think that Mary set it up like it's a counterpoint to, she has this dream of a guy showing up to the house, and it's in her mind shot from underneath, and he's oppressive power, and he's coming to tell her the story explaining Mr. Tuttle, and she comes up with an evolving story as she thinks about it. And then later on, a man really does approach her, and it is a little bit oppressive, and she thinks this might be the moment that the psychiatric thing is going to play out, and someone's going to tell her what's going to happen. And then she loses interest precisely whenever it's a dumb, unmeaningful thing that she doesn't really have to worry about. Really, he's here to get a chest of drawers back, and it's not meaningful anymore. And so she just kind of tunes it out and is left back in ambiguity without that. Even though she imagined it and then it really happened, it didn't provide her imaginary answer. And so it's, just a consequence of just life coming back in and not really helping out much.
It shows the narcissism on both ends as far as, she drops or she stops paying attention, like you mentioned, when it has no significance to her. And what the owner precisely is doing is seeking out an object that has significance to him, and she's standing in his way. So communication kind of breaks down when, as Kant would say, when you're using another person as an ends rather than a means.
One of the things that you could compare, I think, is the final performance piece that she does with Mr. Tuttle himself And one of the differences there, I think, that are interesting, because they're both sort of, if you see Mr. Tuttle mostly, I guess, as I kind of see him as a manifestation of her grief, or a projection, a sort of amalgam of memory and emotion and things like that. That sort of is a creation of hers as well as the performance piece at the end. And the difference between those two creations, I think, is sort of an interesting one, because one of the things that she does in that piece at the end is she is really imitating physically parts of Ray and parts of Mr. Tuttle. And one of the things involved in that is it's the body, right? You know, Mr. Tuttle a lot of times is, to me, associated with the mental, right? He's associated with ideas and memories and things that are sort of like floating around in your mind. Whereas, you know, when she's actually acting out the physical things that, you know, the physical changes that her body goes through, that's a different way of knowing. It's no longer this sort of heady, sort of, slippery idea kind of way, but it's this physical thing that you feel, and it's not wrapped up in concepts so much. And it seemed like that was a sort of a mile marker for her in her grief. Part of the process of getting through the whole thing, or going through what she was going through, was like, that was some mysterious part of it anyway. Did you guys get any of that sense? That there was a difference between that kind of knowing and the kind of knowing that she was doing with Mr. Tuttle?
I hadn't really thought of those differences until you put it like that. But yes, I mean, she's trying to get hardcore knowledge from him, recounting the dialogue and the facts of how he and whatever. But then she's imitating him personally and manifesting him, which I think is the coolest thing about the ending and the performance piece, is that she manifests this creation that we took to be material, maybe this is a real person. But then at the end, I think it's pretty clear that this is her creation. And I think it's beautiful how she brings it to life.
And then uses him to process it, uses him to find her art in it, and then is ultimately dissatisfied. Because how could you ever put the grief of losing someone into an hour or 90 minutes? How could anyone ever really do that? So there's got to be, he was, Mr. Tuttle, very helpful in getting that out. But if you were going to make a true piece of art about loss, then it would be every moment of every day. There would be a little chunk of that moment that you would have to contribute to the piece, because it doesn't end. You can't just make an artwork and close the door on it. It becomes a huge part of your waking life, of your sleeping life, of your entire life. And especially if you lose someone and it's got all of that pathos wrapped up in it, of suicide and the third wife and the second wife and the rented house and all of those things. So I can understand why she would want to do it, and I can also understand her dissatisfaction, like having to do something, and then there's going to be dissatisfaction.
Yeah, well, and I think that, with that dissatisfaction, there's a little bit of a silver lining, because she would like to do more of it. I think that would drive her to do more and dig deeper, and maybe even that would be dissatisfying at the end, ultimately. I think that there's something to that.
Well, isn't it when she finally sort of breaks down and cries? That's after the section with the performance piece and the art review, right?
I don't think so, but
no.
I think that's whenever she handles it and then remembers the breakfast in a different way.
There is a final section after that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
right?
there is.
She goes back to the house again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And that's whenever she sees the Japanese lady again and remembers how she would have done it differently had she had noticed the balled up hands. She would have put that into her work.
Yeah, no hands. Take the hands away. That was interesting, I thought, what she actually would have done. Empty sleeves.
Yeah, because part of the piece is like she's obsessed with like this materiality of the body, and she's cleaning herself and exfoliating and stripping herself away, like she's trying to whittle herself down to some essence, and it parallels this constant perception of the little moments and the little tics and idiosyncrasies that make up our relationships with people. There are all those little tiny moments and things like that add up to the whole thing, but every single one of them just seems like a little trivial absurdity by itself. And it's sort of that way with your body too. I mean, your fingernails, your little things that you wash down the drain, they're you too. And you're made up of these little bits.
Yeah. And wouldn't it be nice sometimes if you could actually exfoliate someone from your life? All I have to do is go have a pedi, and they'll do the soles of my feet, and off you go. I need my brain exfoliated or my mind exfoliated.
I can see the commercial now, Dove, get rid of him. And Daniel, you were right. It is in the section afterwards of the critic piece that she has the breakdown and remembers the breakfast and cries.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering then, because if that performance piece, the whole time she's trying to hold on to Ray, she's trying to, find a way to, just hold on to him and sink her claws into him, not let him go. And I wondered if the performance piece was like the next level to a way to, that total imitation was like the next way to hold on to him, like become him. And then finally, even that didn't work. And so finally she realized she's going to lose him. She's got to let him go.
Well, and it's interesting that she doesn't, manifest Ray so much as Mr. Tuttle. That is actually the, I think the best way to put it, it's like he's this grief avatar or something. And that's what she finds the solace in a little bit. And I find it really interesting that in the interview, she channels Mr. Tuttle live at the dinner table with her friend before leaving. And it's almost like that's the break point of reality. That's where you go to whenever you don't understand anymore, when things are overwhelming and you're just a ball of nerves. There was something about whenever I just lost it, but whenever she goes up to comfort Mr. Tuttle, and she realizes that, he doesn't have any defenses. He's just like an open wound, basically. And she tries to comfort him. Maybe one of you will remember it. I'm trying to find it. But it starts off something like, he was lonely, basically. It was just that simple and true. And he didn't have any defenses against himself. I think that that's what's going on with her. She's just, like raw and, asking questions, and she can remember things, and then it kind of like goes away. And so I think it's important that, Mr. Tuttle is what arrives on the scene here, rather than, exactly her just trying to hold on to Ray. That's a large part of it, but there's also something about her own identity that she's dealing with too as this person. There's also the Japanese woman that she's taking into account, so it's not just about this, it's this larger, think about existence.
Reminds me of this one Black Mirror episode where this woman is grieving and her husband has died, and like there's this service now that will provide this robot version of your dead deceased partner or whatever returned to you, and it yeah, and it's like it comes back and it mines all the data from his social media, so it acts like him and it looks just like him. And she gets into it for a while, and then it's like all of a sudden, no, this is not him, and it's too close, it's too creepy. And it seemed like to me like the deal was like Nathan's saying, like, yeah, you're wrapped up in all of that history too. And now with it just recycling, the thing about your relationship with them was that you were always creating new moments. The present was always, novel, but now it's just like sort of recycling and reflecting the old, and, it's not authentic anymore.
In that Black Mirror, she has a kid, and I think that's part of it. It's like the real world comes in, but she does let the kid, like visit him once a year or something like that on her birthday up in the attic.
That's right.
Super creepy.
Yeah.
I found that bit on 96. It's whenever she goes up and hears Mr. Tuttle crying, she says, "He was scared. How simple and true. She tried to tend him, numb him to his fear. He was here in the howl of the world. This was the howling face, the stark, the not as if of things. But how could she know this? She could not. Maybe he was just deranged, unroutinely nuts. Not that it's ever routine. A nutcase who tries to live in other voices." I like that, unroutinely nuts. But, basically, like he's just exposed to the way things are.
You want to do some favorite lines or...
We haven't talked about the webcam on Finland's busy highway or not so busy highway.
Oh, yeah, Kotka.
Yeah, Kotka. I just think that's really important. She used it as a projection in her piece. It's this kind of place without time. You can see the cars coming and going, but the way that the camera is set up and the way that the weather is, the way that like the light is, it's just dim and foggy and gray. It looks like any time. And whenever you see a car go by, it could just be any car. And it's something that's comforting to her. And I think it's kind of tied up in the Tuttleness. It's this kind of like a blank place. It's untethered from reality in the usual ways. It's not like you can see a big landmark or, there is the timer going in the bottom right of the screen, which is interesting, but that's almost like a joke. It almost highlights the real fact of it being kind of like any time. Even though there is, you can see it's December, whatever. It doesn't matter. It just, I don't know, like seeing that the timer's there almost proves that it's timeless, because by trying to hold on to it, by trying to give it a number, you just connect a series of samenesses basically that are there.
Yeah, it was like her what she's trying to abstract at. It was like it was happening in quotation marks. Her favorite part of the feed was when nothing was happening. In that sense, it like encompassed this abstract experience out there, timelessness, as you said.
Yeah, I wonder if part of that's like, as detached, as close to seeing sort of like the birds see as you can get as a person, like having no personal connection to whatever raw sense data, is coming through your perceptual apparatus, to just have this window into some weird far off place that you have no, personal significance with, whatsoever.
Yeah, I'd like to see some of these now. I mean, I think there's one on a space station, which I think is like just a 24/7 feed of its orbit. And I think they do some with like endangered animals or whatever, or like have, one near a falcon's nest or something. I wonder if you could really find this. But then again, usually whenever that's the case, you find it's an invention of the author. Just like I would love to see the real map pictures that were supposedly taken in The Map and the Territory by Houellebecq, or the 24/7 Psycho screening, but I have a feeling that those never happened.
Oh no, DeLillo's, the 24-hour Psycho, I think, was a real
awesome.
There's some reviewer I read talking about, I mean, many of his books at some point have some kind of art in them, and a lot of times it's a real art, and he's either, like in this one, he made up the art thing almost just like so he could write the review. You almost wonder, like, why doesn't he just like start writing art reviews, because he loves art so much and he loves to write about it so much. But yeah, a lot of times it is a real thing.
See, I felt like that is, whenever you have an imagination of something, but you can't really be a body artist yourself, like this is a way of, I would do this if I had the time or inclination, but I just don't realistically. And this is the way I can put this forward. I can write the review of the thing I wish were real. And because I'd never had heard of someone, dancers, sure, but a body artist? I've never heard that.
I wonder if there is such a thing. I mean, I guess I just thought of it as like a performance art or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose we can make our way around to favorite lines.
Cesare, you got any?
I actually think my favorite one was, I think you actually said the part, Laura, at the very beginning with the twirling leaf. I just love that description. Say another one on my version of page 82. This is when she's with Mr. Tuttle. He was staring at her. He seemed to be staring, but probably wasn't. She didn't think his eye was able to search out and shape things. Not like normal anyways. The eye is supposed to shape and process and paint. It tells us a story we want to believe. That's it.
Well, that's like the bird thing that you were bringing up, Daniel, again. Just to see that, just to hear that now connects that with what we were talking about, those layers of perception and different people.
Daniel, you got one?
Yeah, I don't have a favorite line, actually, because I don't have the book in front of me. The only thing I'll say, I guess, is that I love DeLillo's work. I enjoyed rereading this book. One of the things that constantly impresses me about him is that he's so versatile, and he's not a one-trick pony like so many authors are. He can find any subject and just trust in his ability to give it really close attention and examination and come up with something. And time again, he seems to come up with more than meets the eye. He seems to just find this incredibly fresh and philosophical take on things. And, this is not a ghost story like any I'd ever read before.
First of all, I have a couple of lines that a lot of his lines just jump out at me. I'll give you a couple of one-lines that I just love, and then 2 paragraphs. I could just read the whole book. Anyway.
We're almost there.
Okay. All right. One of the lines I liked was, he violates the limits of the human. I liked, it is about who we are when we are not rehearsing who we are. I like that one. And then these are 2 paragraphs that I like. Why shouldn't the death of a person you love bring you into lurid ruin? You don't know how to love the ones you love until they disappear abruptly. Then you understand how thinly distanced from their suffering, how sparing of self you often were, only rarely unguarded of heart, working your networks of give and take. And then this paragraph, which I really love. She cleaned the bathroom using the spray gun bottle of disinfectant. Then she held the nozzle of the spray gun to her head, seeing herself as doing what anyone might do alone without special reference to the person's circumstances. It was the pine scent bottle, the pistol grip bottle of tile and grout killer of mildew, and she held the nozzle, the muzzle to her head, finger pressed to the plastic trigger with her tongue hanging out for effect. This is what people do, she thought, alone in their lives. And then one last line. This line I say because when I read it, and it's toward the beginning of the book, and just one line, but it just stunned me. And that happened periodically throughout this book when I just like, I would just catch my breath like, oh my God, and this one just really, really took me. Anyway, this is what it was. Only one line. The plan was to organize time until she could live again. In many ways, I think that's kind of what this whole book is about. Because when you're trying to organize time, you're also going into how you can't organize time, how it's uncapturable.
All very nice. Okay, mine's a paragraph, sorry. And this is when she's talking with Tuttle, but at some point, Ray's real laughter comes in. It's a defining moment for her. And she said this was not some communication with the dead. It was Ray alive in the course of a talk he'd had with her in this room not long after they'd come here. She was sure of this, recalling how they'd gone upstairs and dropped into a night of tossing sensation, drifts of sex, confession and pale sleep, and it was confession as belief in each other, not unburdenings of guilt, but avowals of belief. Mostly his and stricken by need, and then drowsy sex again, two people passing through each other, easy and airy as sea spray, and how he told her that she was helping him recover his soul.
Yeah, I think that's a big indication there too of this third wife, again, like we, wondered why then.
And then why did I guess I couldn't help him recover his soul enough that he wanted to keep it in this world, the kind of grief that goes with that loss.
All right. Mine's on 130. It's 3 sentences. Take the risk. Believe what you see and hear. It's the pulse of every secret intimation you've ever felt around the edges of your life. I mean, let me just say, I just really love this book. To the extent that you all did, I'm happy for it. You're welcome. Thanks for reading it. Yeah, I mean, just the reveal at the end. I've talked about this before, and so I feel like I've been holding back a little bit. But I was just so stunned with how she actually brought this thing to life. It was like a third twist that this was something that she had some kind of control over, and was able to not just be haunted by it, but actually become the ghost in a way. It's just a powerful story.
This is one of those. This is one of the books that I just read front to back really quickly, and as we're talking, there's so much that I missed and didn't pay attention to that it deserves.
Can't waste words.
Was there another one that was like that for you, Cesare?
Yeah, I'll just I'll put up the excuse of reading way too much and being stressed out, but this I'm definitely gonna go back to this book because there are definitely a bunch of gems. I think it's worth definitely exploring more what we talked about.
I kind of want to read some of his early novels now because I've read so much of his mid to late stuff that I'd like to see sort of how he started out and matured before he became like this super complicated writer that he is now. The thing that's weird that I noticed about Don DeLillo as I was going through doing a binge of his books is that every single one feels a little bit different. And it was only after 5 or 6 that I really felt like I started to see the common sort of the traits of a single writer behind all these books and the voice of Don DeLillo, to identify a style. I mean, he's really versatile to me.
Well, let me say, I think one thing in common is just having read White Noise, and I don't think that I read Point Omega, but I must have. I think I did read it. Point Omega is about the family and the...
You did.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then I'm getting them mixed up because the endings are always very powerful for me. I mean, so if you read White Noise, no spoilers, but there's a huge turn of events in the second part. And the same thing with Point Omega at the end, whenever, I think about the scene that he has with the nun at the end is one of the most powerful sections of the book that kind of comes out of nowhere. And it seems like you're in a post-apocalyptic world in the second half. And there's always this but I can't characterize beyond just those three that I've read. But I'm always surprised by how powerful they are, though they're rooted in like dinners with families, and then they'll take you on a road trip with death in the rearview mirror coming for you. In the case of the Toxic Airborne event and Point Omega. So
I just read his new one, 0K, which is all about sort of like cryogenics and like consciousness being uploaded into the machine. And, you know, it's sort of the same kind of futuristic stuff he's hinted at all along.
Yeah, because if you read Point Omega, the fella that he's friends with, the main character, I forget his name, Daniel, but the friend that, you know, is like the loner intellectual, and he, you know, the narrator is a master of Hitler studies, you know.
Oh, you're talking about
I am? Okay.
Point Omega was the one where the guy goes out to the desert.
That's right. I've got them switched then.
The former military guy. It's kind of based on that Fog of War documentary with Robert McNamara.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was the connection there, because I like the Robert McNamara documentary. But yeah, I'm getting them switched. But that one character he's friends with, you know, just the joy of the book for me was just hearing his thoughts on how we reproduce culture and like his far out thoughts, you know, that so there's just a lot going on here intellectually with the characters. And
I think like if you want to do white noise, like for me, the way to do it is on audiobook, because the version that's out there, the actors they have doing it are so deadpan. It makes it really funny, which was like, it really kind of threw me because that was the first DeLillo I ever read. And then when I read more, I was like, wow, this isn't funny. I thought they were all going to be that funny.
This isn't funny.
No. There's nothing funny in this body artist.
I just listened to Infinite Jest. It's 55 hours long.
Whoa.
And that's without, they just have someone come in and say the number for the footnote. They don't read the footnotes. I mean, the end notes. That's without the last, 100 pages of end notes in whatever 6-point type.
How was it to listen to? Because I've sort of like toyed with that idea, but I was afraid because of the footnote structure that I wouldn't be getting the real experience.
I think that it would be better if they actually had given you the opportunity to listen to the footnotes, but I do think it's a good way to process the book, because there are parts of it. It's interesting. The parts of it that I found tedious when I read it 20 years ago, they flopped. Because there's sections. There are different characters, different sections that are going on. So I really enjoyed it, and I love his use of language. When I say that there are things that are DeLillo, I guess that he and Don DeLillo developed a friendship, of correspondence, and a friendship.
Really?
Yeah, when David Foster Wallace was still alive, and the casual way. I think that in the beginning of this book, he used it. David Foster Wallace will say, and so like the thing, and so he'll actually use those words, and so like the way that people speak. And when David Foster Wallace does it, it's interesting and doesn't bother me. But when people are speaking and they say the word like 1,000 times, or they use the word like in that way, it bugs me. And I do it myself, and I catch myself, and it bugs me. So there's this studied yet casual use of modern tics that I find interesting. Modern use of language.
Yeah, he had a great ear for dialect, all that too, which I think is just a really hard thing to pull off.
Yeah, I love his pacing, David Foster Wallace's pacing, how he can match the tone of what he's writing about with kind of the verbiage and the speed that it's supposed to have.
Cesare, didn't you read Brief Interviews with Hideous Men not too long ago?
I read one of the stories in it, or a couple of the stories in it, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I haven't read it front to back.
There's this one story in there about like a guy at a neighborhood pool or something like that.
I've read the one.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's one of my favorite ones.
I read it, but I read it when it came out. It's been a while.
My favorite short story by him is the I forget the title, but it's the one like Burns Children, the one where the child spills hot water on itself, and it's just a really like one sentence account of that. Incarnations of Burned Children. It was this Esquire story.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. What's next, by the way?
I think Infinite Jest is now like the major one by him I haven't read. I just finished The Pale King. Yeah, what did you guys think about that?
I'd like to stage the scene with him levitating in the bar. Mm-hmm. I'd like to be able to stage it with like some kind of small special effect, but basically having this woman, coming back to him, being such a supreme listener that it gets like supernatural. I think that would just be a cool thing to see, because I could really see that scene in my mind.
Yeah, that was one of the better parts.